Hello, my name is Lee Bynum, and since October 2020, I have had the pleasure of serving as the inaugural Vice President for Impact at Minnesota Opera, which exists on the land of Dakota people. My team and I are tasked with leading the company on issues of access, diversity, equity, and inclusion, community engagement, and education. Our goal is bringing the 21st century anchor arts institution to fruition, which means creating spaces where artists and staff feel safe to be their authentic selves at work, and developing a body of work that intentionally reflects the true diversity of our community and addresses the long-standing barriers to participation for so many. That is why tonight's panel on the representation of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the performing arts is so important. These issues are fundamental to the sort of company we wish to be. Before I turn things over to our panel, I wanted to thank all of you for being here tonight and express my sincere gratitude for the many ways you have supported Minnesota Opera and held us accountable in this space. Tonight's moderator is Eric Sharp, a multidisciplinary theater artist based in Minneapolis. He has appeared on stage nationally and internationally at the Guthrie Theater, 10,000 Things, the Jungle Theater, Atlanta's Alliance Theater, and the Toronto and Edinburgh Fringe Festivals. A member of the Artistic Advisory Committee at Theater Mu, Eric wrote and starred in the world premiere of Middle Brother and was seen in Today Is My Birthday, Hot Asian Dr. Husband, 2 Mile Hollow, 12th Night, and many more. Over to you, Eric.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much to Lee and Minnesota Opera and Theater Mu for co-hosting this conversation this evening. We are here tonight to talk about Asian and Asian American representation in opera and theater, and we have with us a wonderful group of panelists whom I'm going to let introduce themselves. Let's go ahead and get started with Preeti, please.
Hello, good evening. I'm Preeti Gandhi. I'm the Vice President of Artistic at Minnesota Opera. I've been with this company for almost 3 years. Prior to this, I was Artistic Administrator at San Diego Opera for about 5 years. And previous to that, I was a longtime opera singer of many, many years, sang in wonderful houses all around the world, and was very fortunate to explore many facets of the repertoire. I'm really excited to be here with my colleagues to talk about this very important topic today.
And next up is Lily.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lily Tung Crystal. I go by she, her, and I'm the artistic director of Theater Mu. And I'm also an actor and a director. And I actually came to theater through singing, although I actually, funnily enough, trained as a classical singer early on in my life, but moved into musical theater. So I'm excited to talk about this topic, which is somewhat near and dear to my heart, and to be in the room with all of you. Thank you.
And Andrew.
Hi, my name is Andrew Stenson. I'm an opera singer, a tenor, and I came to opera actually seeing my first opera, Carmen, at Minnesota Opera in 2005. I'm from Rochester, Minnesota. I'm an adopted Korean. I've been fortunate enough to sing at opera houses all around the world: the Metropolitan Opera, Dallas Opera, Seattle Opera, the Glyndebourne Festival, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I most recently served on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion subcommittee of the Met Bargaining Committee in the recent AGMA negotiations with the Metropolitan Opera.
And next up, Dr. Josephine Lee.
Hi, everyone. I'm Josephine Lee. I'm an English professor, and I also teach Asian American Studies at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. A lot of my work has been on Asian American drama, and I also do work on theater history and musical theater history in particular. And I did write a book in 2010 called The Japan of Pure Invention on Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado. Thank you.
And rounding out our wonderful group, Rick. Oh, Rick, just want to put your mic on there.
Yeah, that's right. No, it's my fault. I always mute myself. I am Rick Shiomi, and I'm the co-artistic director of Full Circle Theater Company in the Twin Cities, but also was one of the founders and the artistic director at Theater Move for many years, and so happy that Lily has taken over the reins there. I entered theater as a playwright and have gotten into directing and artistic directing, and have directed a number of musicals and had a huge adventure with the very Mikado that Josephine has written a book about. And so we kind of collaborated on that and ended up with many stories about that one. So that's where I'll stop.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists for being here. You know, we have an opportunity tonight that is kind of rare because the worlds of theater and opera, at least locally, I feel like don't overlap nearly as much as they should, in terms of kind of performing arts that have a lot to say to and about one another. So we have a chance tonight to be in conversation kind of across those disciplines and hear different opinions about kind of the state of the art forms today and what representation really means in theater and opera and all of the iterations in between. Before we get to our robust conversation, we're going to begin our evening. Joe Lee has been kind enough to prepare a presentation for you to learn a little bit about the history of Asian representation in theater and opera. So go ahead and take it away, Joe.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here and share with you some historical background, which I think will put some of our questions, which are about the here and now, in context. So I'm going to just go ahead and start with a slide of an opera by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, The Abduction from the Seraglio. And the reason I start with this is it brings up the larger question of Orientalism in opera. And often when we talk about Orientalism, what we mean is a kind of imaginative construction of a geography that can range from Asia to the Middle East to North Africa, but it has a set of familiar character types that we take with us all the way down from the 18th century to the present. And so in this picture, what you see is the Pasha, who is the sort of rather uncivilized and uncouth ruler of Turkish ruler, surrounded by his harem. And you have two rather familiar ideas that are encapsulated here. One, that the Orient is a space of fantasy and pleasure, particularly for Westerners, that they can go there and kind of live a vicarious life, and that is filled with pleasure and luxury and sensuality. And so these figures repeat themselves again and again and again. I'm going to go through several examples that have a particularly American context. On the next slide, you'll see a slide of an opera by Jacques Offenbach, an opera called Bataclan, which was written in 1885. This opera was tremendously popular in the United States and in Britain. It spawned a couple of variations. The English version was called Ching Chow Hai. And in this opera, you'll see, again, the kind of incarnated now Chinese ruler, right, who is also rather whimsical and irrational. It is a comic opera, and there are lots of, again, enjoyable goings on and humorous goings on. But one of the things that I think distinguishes this opera is that the monarch, the ruler, the Oriental ruler, the Chinese ruler, the Chinese princess, as well as two Chinese nobles are all exposed as frauds, right? They're played by white characters who are disguising themselves so well as Chinese that even the Chinese subjects don't recognize them. So what this sets up is this idea of yellowface, right? That white actors can play Chinese or Japanese or any other kind of Oriental character without a lot of additional accuracy, right? That they can pretend and pass for real Chinese people, mainly because the audience doesn't really know the difference, right? They don't really see who Chinese people are. So I'm going to intersperse these fantasies, which were very popular, again, on the European, British, and American stages from the 19th century on, I'm going to intersperse these with some examples of actual Asian performers in America. So my next slide is of a Chinese opera troupe that toured the United States beginning in the middle of the 19th century. And these touring performances were geared towards the Chinese immigrant community, mainly who came first for the gold rush and then to as a labor replacement for freed African-American slaves, and worked in agriculture, in factories, as domestic servants and the like. So my next slide kind of continues this theme. There were famous performances and exhibitions of Chinese and other Asian performers in the United States. Those happened in World's Fairs, grand expositions. In the 1930s, the famous Beijing opera star Mei Lanfang led a very successful tour of the US, performing with a troupe in New York, DC, San Francisco, Chicago, and Los Angeles. But the popularity of these Asian performers was really very dim in comparison with the sort of fantasies of the Orient. So to continue to the next slide, one of the most famous examples of comic operatic performance is Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado. Again, this is a 19th century opera, comic operetta, which premiered in 1885. By the end of its first year, it had been played in Europe and America by 150 companies. And H.L. Mencken, the writer, reported at the beginning of the 20th century that there were over 100 touring performances simultaneously running. And this gives you some idea of how quickly this opera became a kind of huge hit. Now, this opera, if you have seen it, you'll know that there's a lot of satire of British manners. And this is shown in the slide with Gilbert and Sullivan, who are holding Japanese fans. And what this does is it sort of promotes an idea of that Japan is a pure fantasy, right? That there isn't any kind of responsibility to portray Japanese people accurately or in a kind of serious way, that all of Japan is a sort of light entertainment. And this notion is carried through in the use of yellowface. You'll see in the next slide with the New York Gilbert and Sullivan players, that even in 2004, they have preserved the spirit and the tradition of the original Gilbert and Sullivan version, which means white actors playing in a very caricatured makeup and costumes and a very exaggerated manner, these Japanese characters. So this tradition of playing comic opera in particular, Gilbert and Sullivan, has continued. It's also been more recently protested. I think the New York and Gilbert and Sullivan players more recently did a kind of updated version. I've traced a lot of these updated versions, and among my favorites is one that Rick Shiomi has mentioned, which was done by Skylark Opera and Theater Mu in 2013, which is the next slide. And you'll see here that not only has the opera been translated to Edwardian England, and I'm hoping that Rick will tell us a little more about this particular production, but the leads were cast by Asian American singers. So I think that this is actually quite an innovation that does a kind of reverse racial impersonation, as well as a kind of removing the rather stereotypical Japanese style that is used there. To go to my next slide, a few more examples. Giacomo Puccini's Turandot is another kind of Oriental opera classic. This was an opera that was posthumously completed based on a much earlier story, which had been set originally in Persia, what we today would call Iran, but was reset in China. And you'll see by the picture that it contains a trio of three very comic advisors who are named Pang, Ping, and Pong. This gives you some idea of the constant reiteration, the constant presence of these characters, which can only be thought of today as a kind of comic stereotype. To go to my next slide, this is perhaps the most famous version of what we might call an Oriental opera, and that's Giacomo Puccini's Madame Butterfly. It was based on a 1900 staging of a play by David Belasco, a very well-received play, which was itself based on a short story by John Luther Long, again, influenced by an earlier novel, semi-autobiographical novel called Madame Christine by Pierre Loti. The original opera was premiered at La Scala in 1904. I think its premiere was less than fully successful, but then it was revised and became a hit. I'll go to my next slide to illustrate, again, the continuing popularity of Madame Butterfly, which is an opera that consistently makes the top 10 most performed in North America and Europe. I think most of these versions, up until fairly recently, were done in what we would call, again, yellowface, which is the playing of Asian characters by non-Asian actors. Two versions that you see here are at Glyndebourne and Metropolitan Opera. I think that the opera has been made more controversial, particularly in recent decades, for its use of yellowface, but it also contains what people might refer to as a very familiar racial type. And I think this is a particular concern these days after the shootings earlier this spring. There was a lot of concern on the part of my Asian American students about stereotypes of young Asian women that were done in a kind of hyper feminine and very sexualized manner, right? Linking being racially Asian and being female to being an object of sexual desire. We can talk about this, I'm sure it'll come up during our discussion, but I wanted to point out that in this opera has been sort of touted as promoting this image as a kind of romantic ideal. Butterfly is a teenager who is given in marriage, a kind of temporary marriage, to an American lieutenant, Pinkerton, who then abandons her, even though she's very much in love with him. He returns several years later. She has a child. She kills herself so that their biracial child can travel to America to be with Pinkerton and his new white wife. So there was in 1988, a Broadway play by David Henry Hwang, which is on the next slide, called M. Butterfly. And in it, the title character, Song Li-ling, who is a kind of impersonator of Butterfly, tells his interracial lover, "Consider it this way, what would you say if a blonde homecoming queen fell in love with a short Japanese businessman? He treats her cruelly, then goes home for 3 years, during which time she prays to his picture and turns down marriage from a young Kennedy. Then when she learns he has remarried, she kills herself. Now, I believe you would consider this girl to be a deranged idiot, correct? But because it's an Oriental who kills herself for a Westerner, you find it beautiful." So this story has been criticized for its promotion of the butterfly type, the hyper-feminine, over-sexualized young woman who is submissive and passive. This type reappears in later musicals. And on the next slide is a scene from Miss Saigon, which translates the butterfly story to the Vietnam War, and that story is repeated with the character of Kim, who is a young virginal Vietnamese woman who meets an American GI, Chris, in a bar or in a kind of prostitution in a brothel. They fall in love. He has to leave or is evacuated. She has a baby and later kills herself in, again, the style of Madame Butterfly, so that her baby can have a quote unquote better life in America. So this musical has actually been protested a number of times. And for those of us in the Twin Cities, we might remember several iterations of protest against performing Miss Saigon. I have a slide or a picture up here on this slide of a protest at the Ordway Theater in 1999. I think it was the second of 3 protests before the Ordway decided that they weren't going to do this anymore. So I want to reiterate that there are 2 issues going on here, and perhaps we can disentangle them. One is the kind of representation of Asian and Asian American characters, right, which borders on sort of typecasting or stereotyping. The other is the issue of casting, and I think that's also a very interesting issue to pursue. And I want to just share a couple of slides or a couple of illustrations that I'm going to use in my new book, which is a book about actually Black actors who do yellowface and Orientalism in American theater. And so the next slide has a photograph of Camilla Williams, who was the first African-American woman to have a leading role in a major American operatic performance. And that was as Coco-san in Madame Butterfly in 1946. On the next slide is another opera, which is not performed all that often now, but was quite popular in the mid-19th century when it was premiered, which is Giacomo Meyerbeer's L'Africaine, the African Woman. The leading role of Celica, who is a woman who is named L'Africaine, but she's not actually African. She is from an island near Madagascar, and people sort of identify her more as South Asian. Now that role on the next slide was copied by a very famous Black soprano, Anna Maida Hires, who played a character very much like her in a play called Erlina, or the African Princess. So I'm going to end with just a few examples of operas that people know a lot less about, which are operas by Asian Americans. And I'm drawing my list from an excellent article by Nancy Rao on Asian Americans in opera. And so a few contemporary Asian American operas. Earl Kim did an operatic version of Samuel Beckett's short play Footfalls in 1980. There were several large-scale productions of very scenic, very spectacular Chinese stories done by the Metropolitan Opera and the San Francisco Opera with various composers in the 2000s and 2016. And go to my next slide, which is An American Soldier, an opera that has a libretto by David Henry Hwang, who also did M. Butterfly. And this opera depicts the plight, a real life story of a young Chinese American GI who basically was racially harassed and eventually died very tragically. Byron All Young wrote the music for Stuck Elevator, an experimental opera with the libretto by Aaron Jaffaris. And my final 2 slides are of some operas that were done by Du Young, a Chinese American composer. She wrote a very interesting opera called Angel's Bone, which was performed in 2015. And that opera treated sort of 2 angelic characters who come to Earth and are then employed, or would you say kind of sent into slavery by a white couple. And the opera kind of comments on immigrant labor and exploitation. And so the final slide is of another opera with music, a collaboration between Du Young and Raven Chacon, who is a Native American composer. And it's an opera called Sweetland. The librettist, my colleague at the University of Minnesota, Doug Carney, who is an African-American poet, and Aja Kushwa Duncan, who is Native American. They did a very interesting libretto. This opera was really, it's available actually on video if you go to Sweetland, if you Google it, and it was done in an outdoor setting, kind of natural setting, and it has a very interesting score. So I'm just going to go ahead and end this so we can get to the exciting discussion part. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joe. It's always such a pleasure to get a historical context from you. Joe has taught classes not only at the University of Minnesota, but also for us at Theater Mu, and we just so appreciate your historical perspective. So thank you. We're going to start out the evening. We'll ask questions of our panelists, and then other panelists might pop in to offer their wisdom as well. But we're going to go ahead and start with Andrew. Andrew, we got to see you in one of those photos in the slideshow. And as you mentioned, you've been able to be in rehearsal halls and theaters and opera houses all around the world. I'm just kind of curious, as an Asian American performer raised in Minnesota, when you walk into these rooms, let's say that you're in a rehearsal hall, sitting down for your sitz probe in a place other than Minnesota, what are the kind of issues that you hear folks talking about in terms of representation in this art form, in opera in particular, and how are you interfacing with those conversations when you're in those rooms?
So one of the biggest issues that we have is when I go into these rooms, I very, 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 very rarely see anyone who looks like me, much less anyone who shares my experience. It's always a major event to me if I'm working in a cast or at a company where there might be more than a couple Asian people working in the company, much less on a show. So on something like American Soldier, it was very, very special to me to be working with Asian creators, with an Asian cast about our own issues. And that's only happened on American Soldier. I was covering in Dream at the Red Chamber at San Francisco Opera as well. And that might be it. And every now and then I get to have Asian castmates. I think I had 2 in Candide at Glimmerglass, and that feels like an event to me. I have something that I can share with people that I normally don't get to. And so I think therein lies the issue, is that there is very, very little Asian representation in the business.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, and I don't have my hands on the stats for the opera world, but I know through the Asian American Performers Action Coalition in New York that roles on Broadway, we as Asian Americans and Asian performers occupy less than 4% of those roles in any given year. We're actually one of the demographic groups that is going down in representation, where other demographics and folks of color are seeing increases, not across the board. But I really hear you in terms of that being an event to see someone that looks like you in the rehearsal room. I'm just curious, because you said you've done some EDI work, some equity work with these companies. Where do those conversations begin? Do you feel like that you enter those conversations at that kind of inflection point where there has been an infraction or a problem, or do you feel like you get a kind of chance to set the tone yourself?
One thing that I was really pushing for in this last round of negotiations, which actually I was very fortunate to get some help from Preeti on, is we were trying to address some issues of typecasting. And going into shows like An American Soldier, it's a fantastic opportunity. I've created plenty of roles for the Asian characters, but that also is a double-edged sword. I was able to debut at the Lyric Opera of Chicago singing Gen Watanabe in the opera adaptation of Anne Patchett's Bel Canto, who's the Japanese translator for a Japanese businessman who's one of the two leading couples in the show. And I was very fortunate to be able to return to Chicago to sing Così fan tutte in standard repertoire, as we would say. But there are other places where you might be dangled this cookie, so to speak, of a debut at a major house doing race-specific casting. And that might be it. I've had plenty of companies, they'll dangle that and they're like, oh, well, we could talk about some other things. And then you give them what they want, radio silence, you're done. And it's hard because you don't want to pass up a great opportunity and a great debut and a great job with exposure. But sometimes if you take that job, you may never break out of what you're pigeonholed into. A big thing that we addressed was Porgy and Bess for Black singers, and that there are careers that have been completely pigeonholed into roles in Porgy and Bess. And so with these debuts coming sometimes with modern pieces, if you're an Asian singer who sings standard repertoire really, really, really well, your biggest exposure to the company is going to come in a modern piece sometimes, which might not display your singing the best, which sometimes might display your acting the best. And that might be your only impression and your final impression with the company. So a big push I was trying to make is to create opportunities for people who debut in race-specific casting to have a feature later on lined up for standard repertoire, as we would call it, so that they have the opportunity to be seen as something other than just the race-specific person in the race-specific show.
Yeah, I think there's that idea that for some folks, they might think that casting the Asian American performer as the one culturally specific role in an opera is quote unquote doing the work, and being able to introduce some more subtlety to that conversation is always needed. The next question I have is for Preeti. I'm curious, given your long history as an opera performer, as well as the member of Minnesota Opera, and kind of being an observer and a participant in this practice for many, many years. I'm curious what you think when you see, a presentation like Joe's in terms of these kind of issues that come up around these problematic roles, and kind of your take on what we do with the canon in those situations.
Thank you, Eric. Yes, this is a question I get a lot lately, and something that I think about a great deal. There are so many different viewpoints on this question. And like Andrew, as a longtime opera singer, for me, the first place that I approach opera is the voice. To be an opera singer means you are an Olympic athlete, and you become an Olympian in your craft. And what we do is, for many years as an opera singer, you study for this incredible music. Usually we are raised on the traditional repertoire, in the bel canto technique of singing, in the roles of the greats like Tosca and Carmen, and all of these roles that we learn how to sing with the perfect ah vowel and the lifted palate and projection in a 4,000 seat house with no microphones. And this is how we enter the opera world, focusing on our craft. And then we come into the opera world, and all of a sudden there's race specific casting, there's non-race specific casting. There are these questions of now the traditional canon having these issues from the lens of today, which is so important for us to tackle. And I have conflicting thoughts depending on how the flavor of the conversation is going. There are days when I feel like, yes, we need to change all of those narratives. And then there are days where I think, but I love the traditional repertoire and I don't want to kill it. How can we perform it? How do we reframe those narratives so that those of us who trained on these roles and want the chance to sing that incredible music have that chance to do so, while honoring who we are in our culture and honoring Asians in opera, not just Asians, but all cultures and how they are represented. So this is something that occupies my mind a lot lately, especially now that I'm on the other side of the stage, as it were, in administration. And I find that sometimes my opinion runs counter to many BIPOC singers and creators in the community, and sometimes it aligns with people. And what I like to tell people is the first place that I approach it is the voice. To me, opera, first and foremost, is an art form that starts with the human voice. And I talk about this all the time, because for me, it's about who do we cast, and I'm speaking right now of the traditional repertoire. Who do we cast that has the power and the emotion and the storytelling craft and the voice to tell the story most effectively? And that is where I begin. When we talk about race-specific casting, it's so hard because as an opera singer for almost 20 years, I have to tell you, there are very few operas in the traditional canon that were centered around South Asian Indian stories. And when I started singing, there were maybe 3 Indian Americans in the opera field as singers. Of course, there was Zubin and Zarin Mehta, who were conducting and very famous at that time. But in terms of singers starting out, there was really, when Andrew was talking about walking into a room and nobody looking like him, that was pretty much my existence for almost 20 years in the opera community. I maybe started to bump into a few other Indian Americans along the way, 5 or 6. And like Andrew said, it was an event. It was an absolute event. I just couldn't believe it. And for a while, I would keep track. When I moved into administration, I started keeping track of all the Indian American and South Asian singers and creators that I knew about, because I wanted to know in the future, who are these people when I want to start creating stories based on Indian mythology and Indian stories. Who are these people that I can tap? I'm so happy to say that I've stopped that list because there are so many more in the field, so many more than there used to be. And it's such a happy occurrence for me. So I'm so happy that that representation is coming in the field now. When you talk about the traditional repertoire, it's so difficult. There's an opera called Lakme that is extremely popular for the flower duet. And many people have heard this flower duet. I think it's on the British Airways commercial. It's one of the more famous iterations of the flower duet. And it is a gorgeous piece of music. And the mezzo in that duet is Malika, who is the Indian servant of the princess Lakme, not exactly a princess, she's a Brahmin's daughter. And Lakme is a very difficult role to sing. It's a high coloratura soprano, which is not my voice type. And I was singing mezzo at the time, so I would get cast as Malika. I only got to do this role twice because Lakme is not performed that often. It is not produced that often. It's difficult to cast for the soprano. It's a rather static opera. It's incredibly gorgeous music. It also has the problem of the lens of the time of Orientalism, colonialism, not really quite getting the translations of the Indian prayers right. The viewpoint of the Indians in the village as looking through the lens of the British colonizers. I was ecstatic to sing in it because at that time, just getting to be an Indian on stage was an exciting thing for me. To get to wear a sari, you know, nobody had to put makeup on me. They were putting makeup on the other singers who were singing the roles of Lakme and any other Indians in the crowd, which at that time was not shocking. And now as I look back on it, that was maybe 15 years ago. We wouldn't even think of doing that now. The lens and perspective by which we view this is so different now. So when we talk about narratives and race-specific casting, I do have a few red flags that come up because I think if race-specific casting had been insisted for me, I would only ever get to sing Malikas for the rest of my opera career. There would be nothing else I would get cast in. That would be a very short opera career and not very artistically fulfilling for me. So I like to come in as an administrator through the lens of the voice saying, I want to cast people in whatever role they are appropriate for vocally, because that is who we trained. Then when we get into the traditional repertoire like Butterfly and Turandot, Pearl Fishers and Lakme, I start to think, how can we reframe these narratives so that people can still experience this incredibly gorgeous music? How do we reframe these narratives and not apologize for them and say, yes, this is the lens in which they were created. It is no longer a lens that we agree with or that we find ourselves relating to. But we can also recognize that this incredible music has done so much for the field, has done so much for singers like me and Andrew. How do we keep both alive? I don't have an answer yet, but I know that I'm so looking forward to connecting with other Asians in the opera world, not just singers, but directors, dramaturgs, librettists, designers, conductors. What happens when we put all of us into a room and decide to tackle operas like that? Perhaps we'll come up with a solution that we have not found yet. And I'm excited about that when it comes to the traditional repertoire.
Thank you so much. I think what I hear loud and clear from both of you is that it's a question of this kind of critical mass. How many artists with backgrounds like ours does it take in one room to make a change, right? And in positions of power at these organizations. I really appreciate that. I'd like to turn to Rick, who himself knows something about building a critical mass of Asian American talent. Rick, as many of our viewers probably know, but I'll summarize quickly, we know that you were one of the founders and a longtime artistic director of Theater Mu, as you mentioned. I'm curious, as Theater Mu was kind of coming to fruition, and in those early years, what was that like? What was that like to try to build a company and a talent pool where where one had not been cultivated before? I always like to say that the talent, of course, is there. It's just whether or not it's being developed, noticed, cultivated.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like when I first came to the Twin Cities in the early 1990s, basically there were a handful of Asian American actors. This is in theater, for example. And a Among the many kind of obstacles in the way, one to me was the kind of disbelief within the general theater community that Asian Americans could be legitimate performers. That if you were an Asian American and you were a performer, you were an exception to the rule. And so there's always going to be one or two exceptions in a sense, right? But because I feel like as I talked to you before when we were meeting, I had come from the future to Minnesota because I had come from New York and LA and San Francisco, where there were highly developed Asian American theater artists and highly developed Asian American theater movement. And so in that sense, I felt I had no question that it was totally possible. It was just a matter of how do we build it here in the Twin Cities. And to me, I was once on a radio program, and this is about 7 years into MOO, and the interviewer said, well, are you where you think you were going to be now? This is 7 years in. And I said, no, I thought we'd be here after the first year or two. But I now realize that we're talking 5, 10, 15, 20 years. It's going to take that long to build it. And in a sense, I'm so happy to say, yes, it in a sense has been built. The basis of it has been built because those performers really coalesced, came together, were developed. And one of the key things I always felt about Theater MOO was that it was never a closed shop. The two things were, one, we were always looking for new talent and always looking to develop talent, but also I was always encouraging the artists and the actors that were there to work at other companies because it would be so easy for the theater community to say, oh, they are in a hothouse by themselves doing their own thing, and that doesn't really apply to us in the general theater community. But in fact, as artists like yourself, Eric, are getting out and working at the Guthrie, working at the Jungle, working at all these other companies, they are gradually recognizing the sort of regular integral nature of Asian American theater artists in the Twin Cities. And it's kind of a one small pool. But if you look at America, to me, that's the challenge now, I feel like, in opera. And as Preeti says, sort of compared to 5, 10, 15 years ago, the number of South Asian opera performers now is so multiplied, and it's growing. And I would like to say the same for other Asian American artists in a sense. And so I really feel like that's all has to be proactive. Before we started Theater MOO, I would say none of the theater companies in the Twin Cities had any vested interest in developing Asian American artists, theater artists. Theater MOO brought that vested interest, developed those people. And then when they were sort of getting recognized, then all the other theater companies in the Twin Cities say, oh yeah, we got to have them. And then there's this whole world of the whole phenomenon of foundation driven in many ways support for diversity. And so suddenly Asian American actors not only were bringing their own talents, but they were bringing a certain kind of diversity, legitimacy to the theater community, in a sense, to these various theaters. So I feel like all of that has been a healthy development. And I'm so proud of what Lily's done to continue all of that and continue to develop all of that. The one other thing, though, I just want to mention is the Mikado, is my little experience with the Mikado. And that was that in doing it, as Joe mentioned, it was a collaboration of Theater MOO and Skylark Opera. And what we did is, when I realized the material, I set it in Edwardian England because there was this understanding that, in fact, the Mikado was really a critique of English society. So in any case, the whole Japanese thing, in some ways, was kind of a cover. It's kind of the beard, in a sense. And so by taking away that and setting it in Edwardian England, you have this kind of real sort of social satire of English society and English government. And in a sense, I really always felt like, but because Theater MOO was collaborating, I wanted to cast Asian American actors in the English roles. And that was kind of like tweaking Yellowface a little bit. One move against like 1 million productions of the opposite. But then I did do a second production of it with the local Gilbert and Sullivan Very Light Opera Company here in the Twin Cities. And we used all of their actors, who are 99%, if not more, white actors. And I just wanted to see how that would work. And I was very pleased with that, because I felt like all of their social commentary, all the wonderful music, all the satire, all remained effective. But that could be only done because the Mikado had recently come into the public domain. And so that's a key. I mean, how do you adjust these to such a classic work? And I felt like we had that opportunity, and so that's what we did.
Thanks so much, Rick. Yeah, I mean, it's that what I'm picking up is that there are ways to embrace these canonical pieces that can still speak to us in relevant ways in the 21st century. I'd love to hear a little bit from Lily, current artistic director at Theater Mu. Preeti was telling us that when she considers a piece of opera, she's thinking about the human voice first. And I would just love to hear from your perspective as somebody who's programming seasons of theater, what is it that you're considering in a primary way? And then kind of my follow-up to that is, if you find that there are, problematic issues in these plays that you want to produce, what is kind of your lens or your order of operations in terms of how you address it?
Those are two really big questions. I think it's a little bit different the way I look at programming, because, I run a theater of color. And so in some ways it's harder, but in a lot of ways it's easier, because the body of work that we're looking at in the American canon, and the Asian American writers in the last, few decades have really built a new American canon, and Rick included. And so I'd say that as I'm programming, at least for a theater of color, I think about who our artists are, who the actors are who are available, what fits their skills and talents, and what highlights them to the best degree. I also think about the community in the Twin Cities, because I run a Twin Cities theater company now, which, and so I used to run a much smaller Asian American theater company in the Bay Area. And those two Asian American communities are very, very different. And so while the community in California is very majority Chinese ethnically, the community in the Twin Cities is a majority Southeast Asian ethnically. And so I look at the body of work that we're doing, how we're representing the Asian American diaspora, and thinking, well, we want to do more stories that are representative of the Southeast Asian community, also of the South Asian community, because in the past, Theater Mu had not done many shows that represented the South Asian community. And so, but in reality, the South Asian community, I think, is a higher percentage of the population in the Twin Cities than like the Chinese community. So it's a very different, it's a very different community that we're representing. And so those are the kinds of questions that I ask. And I also think that, that's for what I think about when I program shows at a theater of color. Now, I've never led a predominantly white institution. I can only observe from an external point of view, but, and I get, opera is very different than theater. I think Preeti is correct. Like, singing opera, it requires an Olympian type of commitment, and theater does too, but in a different way. Like I always joke, like my husband plays jazz, and I have other friends who play classical, and the way of being with the music is just very, very different, and the practice that needs to go into being a classical musician as opposed to a jazz musician. And not to like underestimate jazz or theater, but it's a very different set of skills and a very different genre of art. And so I think sometimes when I hear I think that argument that I'm only like, forget about, I'm thinking about The Voice, but I think in theater it becomes like I'm thinking of the best person, the most skilled actor for this job or for this role. And I think through the last decade or so, and through this more recent racial reckoning, that attitude has been questioned at the predominantly white institutions, is in terms of, we hire an actor because they're soprano, or they're an alto, or we hire them because they're male or female, or they're tall or short, and we have certain constructs of there's certain necessities of a character in the energy they have, the personalities they have, and so I think more and more what we're fighting for in anti-racist theater is that people also look at having a diverse cast, or having leveling the playing field so that people from all races and backgrounds can have access to those roles, that the default is not just white. Because what happens is that when people say, oh, I'm just casting for the best actor, oftentimes the default is the best white actor. And so we encourage leaders, especially predominantly white institutions, if they're really serious about doing anti-racist theater, is to really be intentional about the types of actors they're bringing in and where they come from in terms of gender, in terms of race, and in terms of just walks of life that they come from. And so that's one thing I think about, I guess, in programming. And then what was the other question? I think there was two questions in there.
Yeah, it was my run-on question. The second question was just when you come up against a kind of bottlenecks, when you come up against those issues, even that you might not have thought of in terms of programming a show that turn out to be problematic. What's your approach there?
I think that there are, we all try to program work that isn't problematic. And there are also, like Preeti said, there are shows in the canon, like The Mikado, like Madame Butterfly, that are problematic. And yet there are ways to do them, I think, in creative, innovative ways to address the problematic pieces of them. And I think Rick has done a lot in terms of The Mikado, for instance, in setting it in Britain. I also, when I was at Ferocious Lotus, my old company, led a protest with my company in 2016 against a production, The Mikado, that was presenting it as an all has been presented in a very offensive way towards Asians. And through that protest, they ended up writing the new Mikado and set it in Italy with the same music. And so, and it was actually, I saw it, it actually solved a lot of the offensive issues, at least towards Asians. Can't speak for Italians, but so I think there's a way to look at the problematic material, especially if it's no longer especially if it enters the public domain, like Shakespeare, like a lot of the traditional operatic works, where there's ways of innovating and creating and ideating new ways of doing those pieces, so that you're being conscious of the problematic portions. And I do say I watch Madame Butterfly and Miss Saigon, and it bothers me that the trope is it's a common Asian American trope, like Josephine said, where it's a fragile Asian woman who ends up killing herself for the white man that she can have, and for her like half Asian child. Because it just, and also it's all the roles in Miss Saigon of all the women they're prostitutes. So that's another Asian trope, common Asian trope. And so it irks me that show continues. And I think that's why there's been so much protest around it. But maybe there's a way to do it in a less problematic way. I'm not sure what that would be. But I also think, like, for instance, that show is revived like 3 or 4 years ago, I think. And I went to see the revival and I actually walked out at intermission, to be honest. But I went to see the revival hoping that the composers, the writers are alive. Like they had an opportunity to bring that piece back into the 21st century, and they didn't. Like it was very little changed. And so when those opportunities are there, like, David Henry Hwang got the opportunity to do the Flower Drum Song. And I think that in many ways he was successful with that piece in its revival. So I think there's ways to look at the work with a different lens and to be really intentional about it. I also think that if you're going to do a problematic work, and I don't suggest it, but there's also ways of bringing in people who have power in the room to from those communities to consult on those projects and really listen to them. Like I know that sometimes probably white institutions bring in consultants from whatever community they're representing in a show, and then they don't give them power in the room. And that just is, that's just tokenism. So bringing in people to consult and to have power in the room and to really listen to what they have to say. And if there's still problematic elements of the show, then have conversations about it, have information about it in the program, do, talkbacks every night about the potential harm that the show is doing. But I don't recommend it. And I think if you're going to do it, it needs to be done very intentionally.
Thank you. Andrew, go ahead.
Yes, just to go along with that. I really love, for instance, like Rick's idea of casting Asian people as the British people in the Mikado, for instance, that these things sometimes by using one could maybe call creative casting to be in a way subversive to a problematic piece. I have a buddy who wants to do Turandot, like full Mad Max Fury Road, to make this really outlandish, like apocalyptic world so that it really has no semblance of current reality. That's at least one way to potentially get around the many problems that exist in that show. But also that this idea of sometimes even using racially conscious or not conscious, it's in maybe a moment where color, I don't like to use the word colorblind, but using a person of color in a tired old story, which unfortunately a lot of operatic stories tend to be, can really turn the whole thing upside down by just the placement of somebody who looks different. Especially in opera, we spend a lot of time creating a context of the world that we live in, and putting a person of color in a leading role sometimes automatically changes the game without ever having to establish a thing or say a single thing. When Francesca Zambello cast me as Candida at Glimmerglass, I was surrounded by a cast in a musical operetta that is very predominantly white, in very white settings. And me, the short Asian guy, am standing in the middle of a sea of tall white people. And Candide is an other in this show. And immediately, without saying a single thing, boom, you see there's something different about this guy compared to everything else. And that has a lot of power sometimes. And I don't think people are necessarily considering the impact of this and how it can really revitalize a lot of things within the canon. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to open it up to Joe, and I'm just curious, you were giving us this wonderful kind of historical context on how these stereotypes seem to propagate themselves and keep coming back. And I'm just curious from your perspective, why does that happen? Well, what is it about those stereotypes that makes them so enduring?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I think that stereotypes, at least I talk to my students about it in this way, are enduring because in some level, they're not just misrepresentations, they're also useful to whoever's in power, right? So for instance, blackface stereotypes, images of enslaved people, Black people as I guess the modern equivalent would be called shucking and jiving, right? As a sort of comic, simple-minded, ignorant servants or slaves, right, who were happy to be on the plantation. That served a function, right? That served the function of teaching people that racially, anyone with dark skin was meant for servitude, right? So it serves a kind of ideological purpose, and I think continues to serve that, which is very, very sad. So that's the dark side, I think, of why stereotypes have been around for so long, is people need them in order to cast another group of people into subservience on some level. So I think there's that. There's also the thought that in the case of Oriental stereotypes, that they serve the function of creating a kind of fantasy world that was so foreign and so alien that people could represent it in whichever way they wanted, which is something of, there's a lot of slippage in the term Oriental. So people are saying, well, like Aladdin was supposed to be in the Middle East, but now it's set in China, right? So people, these stories migrate and stereotypes translate from one group to another. And so they're useful in that sense too. They're useful both to create a kind of fantasy world of white escape, but they're also useful in order to be able to reapply an old formula to a new group. So for instance, the stereotype of the invading Chinese laborer, the yellow peril, right? That in the late 19th century, there was tremendous anti-immigrant, anti-Chinese violence, which I think culminated in the passage of laws, right? The first law to bar immigration on the basis of national origin and race was the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. So they barred and later extended that to all people from what they called the Asiatic Triangle, which included China, Japan, India, Pakistan. I mean, that whole area was, people could not come and they could not become naturalized citizens. So I think this idea of Asians as invaders, then I think you can see it traced, first of all, into the anti-immigrant sentiment we have today. And then unfortunately, post 9/11, it's become these sort of invading terrorists, right? That kind of Islamophobia comes to us from like the Crusades. So you can see the translation of these animosities. And maybe that's why there's a kind of enduring idea. In the theater, I think a lot of it has to do with formula, right? That at a time when you didn't have a lot of actual Asians because they were barred from immigrating and becoming part of the American fabric. So the prevailing image you recognize was the kind of clown on stage, right? The immigrant figure with the buck teeth who spoke gibberish, or this beautiful exotic woman who was so desirable but had to kill herself in the end. All of those became replacements for actual people that you couldn't have contact with, right? So it was much easier to believe in the stereotype than to confront a real person who wasn't actually there. So I have that thought. And then I had some thoughts while other people were talking. May I share them now, Eric?
Of course.
So it's really interesting. One of the things, I wrote my first monograph, my first book on Asian American drama. And then since then, I've written two other projects that are more about theater history, and particularly going back to the 19th century. And I'm sometimes feeling like a theater history geek, but I think it's sort of useful to think about two concepts that, while we think of them as being fairly recent, are actually quite old. So I think Andrew brought up the idea of creative casting, right? Which we sometimes call non-traditional casting. It's this kind of, in a Shakespeare play, you, Eric, could be Puck, right? That an Asian American actor can be Puck, and an African American actor can play, the king, and all of these roles can be cast by people of different races. And that idea that the actor's body is somehow neutral, right? Racially neutral. That actually was true in the 19th century, but only white bodies were considered neutral, which is why you have things like yellow face and black face and red face, that the white actor could be easily take on all these roles, right? It didn't really matter. And in the same way, you can have plays, classic plays played in Japan, where all the actors are Japanese, regardless of whether they're supposed to be Italian or some other, race. So there has been a long-standing tradition by which actors can transform themselves into any characters you like. But I think we've become very, very sensitive to that in terms of racial representation of the United States, simply because we live in a segregated country, segregated by law as well as by ideology. So my last thing that I'll say on this matter is this whole idea about what do we do with old classics. And I actually have an idea about Madame Butterfly, because I think if you go back into history, you'll find that what we think about as a tradition is simply a social construction, right? It was made up and produced at a certain time. And everybody thinks, well, it always has to be that way. Just because the Savoy did the Mikado this way, we have to do it that way. And so what's interesting about Madame Butterfly is you go back and look at the text that it was based on, like John Luther Long's short story, which is like the most direct connection, the most, there's the names are the same, the plot line's the same, with one major difference. At the end of John Luther Long's story, Butterfly does not kill herself. She thinks about it. She picks up the knife, and then in the next scene, Pinkerton's white wife and the rest of them go back to find her, and she's gone. She takes the baby and she leaves. No one can find her. So I was thinking about that. I saw a production of My Fair Lady at the Guthrie just a few years ago, and they did an ending which is much closer to George Bernard Shaw's ending of Pygmalion, in which Eliza Doolittle doesn't fall in love with Henry Higgins and they're in the room together looking romantically at each other. Instead, she appears like a dream figure, and he's talking to her, but it's very, very clear she's not there. She's skedaddled. Like, who wants to be with someone who's basically abused you, right? So it wouldn't be a real stretch to take Madame Butterfly, do the whole thing, do the gorgeous music. And I agree with Priti all the way that the reason people love these operas is the music, right? There's a reason the composer's name goes first. The librettist is totally forgotten. You can take the libretto, you can tweak it just a little. She doesn't have to die, right? And this would put a whole new twist on the ending, one that I would argue is actually more historical than anything, right? Because in John Luther Long's story, and then Pierre Loti's Madame Chrysanthemum, in Pierre Loti's novel, which is an actual account of Loti actually had one of these arranged marriages with a Japanese woman, he goes back because he thinks she's missing him, and she's there counting the money that he's left her, right? She's trying it out to make sure he hasn't, cheated her of her money. So there's a completely different ending that I think historically is available. Wouldn't it be a hoot, right, to kind of do this instead of having a whole new recreation? You could actually have a fairly standard version of Butterfly, but just change the ending.
That's great. Thank you.
I'm just throwing it out there for all the directors to think about.
Priti, go ahead.
If I could pop in here, so much of what Joe has said has started the wheels turning. I love the ideas. Thank you so much. And what you were talking about earlier about how it was only white bodies that were considered neutral space and you could transform. It made me think of the opposite during my career. And I'm sure Andrew has probably had some instances of this as well, that during my opera career, after I switched from mezzo to soprano, there was an aria from a contemporary opera based on Streetcar Named Desire by Andre Previn. And Blanche sings an aria. Now we all know Blanche is a Caucasian Southern belle who's a little crazy. And she has an aria called I Want Magic that became very, very popular in a certain time frame in the operatic canon for sopranos to come in and sing this for audition. I adored this aria. It is an aria that I sang well. It is an aria I loved singing. And so I would bring it into auditions because I felt that it showed my voice off in all the ways I needed people to hear me. And there were some auditions where I was laughed at for bringing this aria in because I was not going to be cast as a blonde Southern belle, and people would actually tell me that in audition. And they would say, well, you're obviously never going to be cast in that, but okay, I'm glad to hear you sing it. And of course, I was drinking the Kool-Aid of the time and going, oh yeah, well, I guess that's the way it goes. And so I'm so thankful now that our lens has shifted to understand that even I swallowed the Kool-Aid of understanding that I was not a neutral body, that I was allowed to shift into any role that I wanted in the opera world.
Thank you so
much. This is also why I actually love some of the traditional repertoire, because I got to sing Cinderella so many times because Cinderella was considered a role that did not have a specific skin color or culture attached to who she was as a fairy tale figure. So you've just made the wheels turn in so many ways about this particular subject. Thank you.
Rick, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna comment, ask a question actually of Preeti, because I'm not familiar with auditioning procedures in opera. But my vague understanding of auditioning in orchestras and symphonies has become the standard practice of blind auditions, where the people judging cannot see who's playing, and they just hear the music, right? And they judge on that. And I'm thinking what you were talking about originally about how opera is about the voice. You don't have to see the person, in a sense. If you've got the voice, you've got the voice, right? And that Olympic voice. And so if you couldn't see who was singing, but you were just listening to that voice, well, how would that change the practices and casting in opera in America or the world?
Rick, you're bringing up a concept that people would have normally just, balked at. And people have started to sort of whisper this idea of blind opera auditions. Of course, there is the acting element, right? There is the element
absolutely.
of moving around and acting and your charisma in relating to people on stage, which makes it hard to really do that. But it is something that people have started to say, well, why is this not something we're exploring?
Right.
And
I mean, even as a first cut.
I'm sorry?
If you can't sing, you can't sing it. That's, and then later, all these other elements could be part of it.
But of course, so many companies then are bringing up artistic discretion. And Andrew and I recently ran into this, that, we have the artistic discretion of who we want to hire and how they look and how they relate and their acting ability. And that's all very valid points. Yes. But what you bring up is also a valid point. So maybe there's a way that this will be incorporated in the future as a way to experiment with what is it we're truly looking at in our art form? What do we consider important? And what kind of surprises will we have from a process like that we don't even know now?
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to spend these last few minutes kind of going around and hearing from each of you. We've talked a little bit about some of the issues that come up in these art forms in terms of roadblocks to making the art that we want to make. I think it's also a good exercise to be hopeful and to be optimistic when we can. And so I would just really love to hear from you, each of you. What is it that the art form does in 5 or 10 years or 1 year that is the ideal, right? Like, what is the best expression of a production of Turandot? What is the best Asian American play, and what is it doing when Mu produces it? I'm just curious, and these can be wild answers. I just want to hear from each of you. What does an ideal look like? Can we start with Andrew?
An ideal for me is a future where people are able to have the skill and the freedom to tell their stories. We all would love to see more examples of Asian stories in all of our canons, but right now the industry has not necessarily been favorable for people to devote their lives to become a creator in that. So first, I think what we need to do is really support a new generation of creators, of composers, of playwrights, of librettists, poets, etc., so that we really have the brightest making, being able to create our stories. And then I think we can really hit the ground running from there.
And that's so beautiful, Andrew. And I always think about, as an Asian American performer myself, I always think about what our art would look like if we didn't have to think about racism. If we didn't have to think about, walking into a room that feels like a minefield. I know I've certainly felt that. Walking into audition spaces that Preeti was just describing. I know I've certainly been there. Even if they didn't say it in words, you could feel that they weren't considering you based on your race. What does the art look like when we can put all of our energy towards art? What do you think, Lily?
Well, I was going to kind of facetiously say, although it's not quite that facetious, is that I would hope for a time when we're not doing all the Asian American things in May, because I know that it would make my life really easy, much easier. But I have ambivalent feelings about Asian American Pacific Heritage Month, because it's great that we have a month, and a theater move every month is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. The work has to be done 24/7, 365 days a year. That's what it's going to take to really transform, at least for theater, because that's the industry I work in, to transform theater into an anti-racist industry. So like what Andrew said, I hope for the day where all theaters are doing, especially predominantly white institutions, are doing work from a large, a large variety of communities. That they're doing Black stories, they're doing Indigenous stories, they're doing Latinx, Asian stories. They're looking at intersectionality between, in terms of gender, in terms of the LGBTQIA community, in terms of communities of disability. I mean, there's spaces of intersectionality that Theater Mu could be doing better work on. So and it has to happen all year round, not just in May. And I think that you'll hear from BIPOC artists going into predominantly white institutions often that they don't feel totally safe there, that they might do one Black show a year, and that happens during African American Heritage Month, and the one Asian show happens during May and during Asian American Heritage Month. And so I hope for a time where we look at stories, we look at the breadth of the stories that make up the American, who we are as Americans, from all different facets of of the nation, not just from the white default perspective. And I think that the country is going through a huge racial reckoning where we're starting to question what it means to be American, what the judgment of what that means, because it includes all of us, and yet so many of us aren't part of that conversation.
Thank you, Lily. What do you think, Rick?
I echo the comments of both Andrew and Lily. I really feel I strongly feel like the creation of new work is going to be key, and from the perspective of Asian American AAPI work and artists, I think that's going to be super important in the next 5-10 years. And that I think is going to encourage more Asian American opera artists to emerge even better and give them more opportunity. And in a sense, it's always for me a dual track of one. Certainly the development and the creation is important, but at the same time, the opportunity across the board, that's the key. As Andrew's saying, he doesn't want to just play the Asian roles in the Asian operas kind of thing. That kind of cross-cultural intersectionality for all of us is going to be hugely important in the next 10, 20 years. And hopefully we'll get there. That's my speech.
Thank you. Preeti, what do you think?
I mean, such fantastic comments from my colleagues here, and I echo everything they said. And also, what I'm thinking of is in terms of new works, yes, we absolutely need to keep creating new stories. It's part of the continuum of opera. We continue to create new stories and compose new music. And, you know, the test of time will tell what stands the test of time and what goes away into history to be revived 200 years later as a lost gem, right? And I so look forward to us telling our new stories. And what I'm thinking about these days is what Indian stories do I want to be told in the operatic format? Right now, there are operas based on Indian stories that are out there, many of them composed by French and English composers. Satyagraha, Padmavati, Savitri. These are stories told by other people translating the stories from my home culture. What happens when we bring in these Indian authors and playwrights and composers and conductors to tell stories from Indian mythology is absolutely operatic. Novels, Indian novels, contemporary novels have so many incredible stories today that I want to see come to life as stories that are relevant to who we are now as immigrants in this country and what that looks like for us and how are we incorporating our lifestyles here. And I'd also like to say that for me, the ideal is there are so many people right now who are talking about swinging the pendulum the other way and killing their traditional repertoire because of the narratives. And for me, instead, what I want to do is say, people like us, we want to play in these spaces as well. Why on earth should I also not to get play in the traditional opera space? I love that music. Why is it not for me? I want to find a way to make it for people like me, like Andrew, like all of us, because we deserve to play in those spaces too. It is what we studied. This is our art form. This is what we spent our entire life investment on. So I want to make space for all of it because there has to be a way that we can all live in this space together and just expand the operatic narratives rather than shrinking them. And that's my ideal for our industry.
I think that's wonderful. And it's the opposite of the scarcity mindset that we all get into in the arts, right? It is the idea that the table is big enough for everyone if you're intentional about how you're making that table, inviting people to it. Joe, any thoughts? What's your kind of ideal? You've taught this subject matter for many years. You send your students to plays. What kind of plays do you want to send them to in opera?
You know, what I would wish for all you wonderful creative people there is time, money, and space, right? I feel like for all the performing arts, we're at a really difficult time. I mean, it's just been a terrible year for the performing arts. And I do feel like that on top of all the pinches, people, you know, the pinching, the tightening. So not that I'm against commercial theater, but I think that for-profit theater is just, you get yourself in a hole, right? And you need to sort of sell yourself as a commodity. And what kind of artistic or creative license can you take with that without fear, right? So I would love to see more opportunity for creative people to be more creative without worrying about their income stream. I would love to see ticket prices come down. And I would love to see every educational program in the nation include an arts component. I think we're getting into the nitty gritty of why young people don't go to concerts or opera, because they don't have an arts program to introduce them to that vocabulary at a young age when their brains are still pretty plastic, right? So I do feel like I'd love to see on the other side more public arts funding, and particularly for K-12 education, more music programs, you know, get a whole new generation of singers and encourage young singers of color, that this is a profession that not only welcomes them, but can sustain them, right? Because you don't want to encourage this kind of false sense of security if there's no security in the profession, right? And I do feel like that is a huge worry for the performing arts. So just the pragmatic and maybe maternal side of me says, okay, all of this, but I want to be able to pay for it and then have a place to live, right? And food to eat, really good food.
Oh, I second that. I want to be able to feed myself as an artist. I think we all do. You know, Minnesota Opera and Theater Mu are in a state that has really generous arts funding. Springboard for the Arts just launched a universal artist income for the zip code that Springboard is in St. Paul. Theater Move was just named a cultural treasure. Minnesota Opera has this long history of developing new works. So I'm really optimistic that the more kind of space that we can make, the better, and that more than anything, when artists, administrators, and audience members are invited, that they feel like they're able to bring their full selves to bear and all of their lived experiences. We could continue this conversation for hours, but unfortunately we can't tonight. I want to thank once again all of our wonderful panelists, Theater Moo and Minnesota Opera, for hosting this conversation, and to thank you, our audience members on the other side of the internet, tuning in. And I hope that this is the beginning of a lot more fruitful conversations like this. So thank you so much for being here, and have a great night.